I'm delighted, first of all, to say how pleased we are that Sir Hayden is here as Deputy Lord Lieutenant, and we have the Leader of the Council, County Councillors, many local distinguished citizens, and members of parliaments, and of course trustees of the Sir Edward Heath Charitable Foundation, and many guests. We're of course gathered here, and I have the proud privilege of being chairman of the trustees of the Sir Edward Heath Charitable Foundation. We're gathered here because this evening we're going to hear the third Edward Heath lecture. And I was talking on some transatlantic telephone line to Sir John Major just a few moments ago, who said, could I please convey to John Deben, who for some reason he seems to call John Sawingummer, that how sad he is that he's abroad at the moment and cannot attend. And then, of course, he delivered the first lecture. Michael Heseltine delivered the second lecture. And then probably my longest-standing friend and colleague in Parliament, John Deben, is now going to deliver the third lecture. And when I asked John, how on earth do I introduce you? There are 7 pages to your Wikipedia entry. And he gave me a steer and said, just say, John Deben. So that's all I do say. How thrilled we are, John, that you're going to deliver the 3rd annual Edward Heath lecture. Edward Heath, from Munich rebel to father of the house, John Deben.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am singularly honoured to have been asked to deliver the 3rd annual Edward Heath lecture. And that's not just because of the distinction of my predecessors, although that would be honour enough, but because in an important way, my generation was marked more by Heath's influence than that of any other single politician. Like so many Conservative students, I had met him at conferences, heard him speak on Europe, shared his disappointment at de Gaulle's non. But my clearest early memory was the elation I felt when, sitting in a tube train on July the 27th, 1965, I read of Ted's surprise election as leader of the Conservative Party. All had seemed lost when the overnight opinion polls showed that MPs would give the immensely clubbable and popular Reggie Maudling a thumping majority. For those of us for whom Europe was the key issue, the prospect of being led by the nebulous Maudling was deeply concerning. In the event, as so often and as we have seen so often recently, the polls turned out to be wrong, and Heath won by 150 to 133, with Enoch Powell trailing behind with 17. It was the first time that MPs had chosen their leader. That in itself was a victory. And I want us really to pause for a moment on that amazing fact. In our ancient parliamentary system, its oldest and most consistently successful political party had never before chosen its own leader by ballot. That happened for the first time a mere 50 years ago, within the lifetime of almost everyone here. A few exceptions over there, I apologise for that, but that was the moment when what Ian MacLeod had witheringly attacked as the magic circle was finally broken, and the Tory party was no longer in thrall to great and largely aristocratic men. It was, after all, only 2 years before that this tiny group had refused Rab Butler the leadership, and on the basis of so-called soundings, had given it instead to the charming, I've found lovable, but entirely unelectable 14th Earl of Hugh. They had thus handed power to the 14th Mr. Wilson. So it was that Edward Richard George Heath became the first Conservative leader to be elected by the parliamentary party. And in a sense, that was his first tangible success in the battle to bring the Tories into the modern world. The son of a small builder, the product of universal education, he was the least typical Tory leader since Disraeli. And he was faced with a mammoth task. Macmillan had rung down the curtain on empire, but the Conservatives hadn't yet begun to find their role in a post-imperial world. Indeed, the very recent, at the time, Suez debacle had shown just how little the old guard had really understood about the changing world outside Britain. And inside, well, this was a party which felt threatened by the swinging 60s and saw the Beatles as a regrettable and largely inexplicable occurrence. It was a party entirely unprepared for the social upheaval that was about to break and end the deferential culture upon which it had depended for so long. It was a party in desperate need of remedial surgery, and the change in the mechanism for choosing the leader played a small but essential part in that process. Heath had used his role as chief whip first to help secure the change, and then to take full use of it to organise his own election. But even so, his victory was against all the odds. He had, after all, had no high-profile jobs. He was not known for great achievements or the author of significant changes. He had been a technocrat and political manager during the whole of his ministerial career. And that all started when he had become the first of the 1950 entry to be promoted, when he was asked to serve in the whip's office. That meant that he'd only had 1 year on the back benches. And that was no time at all to create a wider political reputation, whether that would have been for good or for ill. But there were, in that 1 year, 2 important indicators of his future course. Very soon after arriving in the Commons, he had helped found the One Nation group, thus putting himself firmly in the great Disraelian tradition. He had also already rebelled against the party whip. Rather surprising, perhaps, for a novice so recently back from the discipline of war. Yet the issue upon which he rebelled was an important pointer to Heath's future stance. The Conservatives were supporting the Labour government's craven refusal to allow Seretse Khama to succeed to the leadership in Bechuanaland, now Botswana, or even to return to his homeland. They had succumbed to the pressure of the South African government, whose apartheid policy was affronted by the fact that this tribal chief had married a white Englishwoman, and even worse, that his people were increasingly supportive of it. Ted was one of 30 who stood out against the consensus view that now seems to us so deeply unacceptable. In fact, this was the only glimpse that his colleagues would have had of Heath, the rebel. Yet that was what he had been in Oxford and would become again as Father of the House. I really wanted to retitle this lecture as Rebel to Rebel, which seems to me to be, roughly speaking, what I'm going to suggest. So he went off to join the whip's office, then to be moved to a junior treasury post, and then back again to become Eden's chief whip, carrying him through the Suez crisis. His loyalty to the man who had resigned over appeasement stifled any concerns that he may have had. That was what was to be expected, after all, of a chief whip, and he lost no friends nor gained enemies over it. I remember it well because in my home constituency of Gravesend, we were all agog over the issue, as our Member of Parliament, the intellectually able and committed Europhile Peter Kirk, was a rebel, condemning Eden's policy in no uncertain manner. Yet even he, enthusiast as he was, never thought that Heath should have behaved differently. And then when Macmillan succeeded Eden, Ted was sent to negotiate our unsuccessful entry into the common market. And for many whom I see in this room, this was the beginning of our long and continued commitment to the European ideal. After the veto, Ted returned as Industry Minister, where he remained until the Conservatives lost office. So this was a career in which Heath had to display little of himself and reveal almost none of his own views, save for his commitment to Europe. By accident, for it couldn't have been by design, he had not had to manage education, save the NHS, or even build a roads policy. His interaction with MPs on constituency issues had been minimal, and the only principle he had had to uphold was that of loyalty. His whole career had been one of conformity. He had never had the opportunity to rebel except that once, and few of his colleagues had any understanding of just how radical he was. However, they should have had no doubt about his determination to reach the top. And the grammar school boy who had made it up to Oxford knew that that meant concentration on doing his job well, while at the same time learning to navigate a way through and around the Conservative Party. That singleness of purpose was largely unencumbered by political friendships. He was close to almost no one in the parliamentary party. There were real friends outside, in particular Madron Seligman, whom he had met at Oxford and with whom he travelled to Poland on the very eve of invasion. The picture of him wandering about with the Germans there and about to take over, and then across Europe into France, from which he escaped with hardly a day to spare. It's part of the kind of foolhardiness and friendship which those two had together. There was also his doctor, Brian Warren, who had looked after him from the 50s, and that malign influence upon whose judgment he too often depended, Toby Aldington. Close to were men with whom he'd gone through the war, and who remained friends with whom he could relax. But none, with the possible exception of David Gibson Watt, were serving members of Parliament. He had had neither the time nor the opportunity to express his political views or build a reputation as a man of a particular tendency. His role in the Whip's office meant that it was his duty to reflect all views and not impose his own. Circumstances therefore conspired to remove Heath from the life of the opposition backbench in what must have been the most exciting of times for a new entrant, as the Labour government staggered to its end in 1951. But by accident, it meant that he did not become, as did Ian MacLeod, a figure of the reforming left. As a whip, he couldn't speak in debates and was denied membership of the One Nation group he had helped to found. He was therefore distanced from the camaraderie which for so many is the essence of Parliament. His ministerial roles made him into a loner, not least because in all those formative years, he never found in the Commons the opportunity for relaxed relationships that he had enjoyed in Oxford, where he had felt at home and had fitted in. There, of course, his position as the Balliol organ scholar had given him very convenient and preferential rooms, where the leading undergraduate Conservatives like Hugh Fraser and Julian Amory met. Heath was in his element, and there was then no hint of that later reserve upon which so many people comment. Nor in Oxford had there been any question of his political views. A staunch opponent of Munich from the first, he welcomed Eden to speak at the Oxford University Conservative Association, of which he was chairman. He was angry when instead of producing an enormous oration attacking the national government, the Nazis and Hitler, he put forward a very usual Conservative speech about how we were very much better than anyone else, much, on the whole, in general. It had been natural for Ted to lead the debates in the Oxford Union, condemning appeasement, as it was for him to take a leading part, therefore, in supporting the independent candidate against Quintin Hogg, the official Conservative. And in that stance, he stood alongside Harold Macmillan, who publicly announced his support for Lindsay, the all-party opposition candidate. Harold Macmillan's book, The Middle Way, exercised a hugely powerful influence over him. And he sums it up simply but very powerfully in his autobiography. It's a phrase that for many of us explains exactly where the Conservative Party has to be if it is to be a party of government. He said, "The middle way represented a sound set of answers to our economic and social problems, avoiding the evils of both an unregulated capitalist system and a dirigiste socialist approach." That understanding and commitment to the conservatism of Peel, Disraeli and Macmillan drove Heath throughout his political life. But it was not a vision that he shared much in the tea rooms of the House of Commons. It was instead his music and later his sailing that provided the outlet that others found in parliamentary dining clubs and bars. Because among musicians and sailors, Ted felt included. Among his Conservative contemporaries, he increasingly didn't feel at home. It was partly the simple fact that he came from so different a background at a time when that really mattered. He would be the first leader since Disraeli who was so déclassé. It was also because his own family upbringing was simply not comfy. It made him angular and often ill at ease. So it was fortunate that his ministerial jobs did not demand much in the way of socialising. Had they, he might never have become leader. It is here that I want to face up to this fundamental problem of Ted Heath. In so many things, he was a giant. Yet there were parts of him that didn't seem ever to have been properly formed. Of no prime minister in our long history could the phrase Renaissance man be more appropriate. Political visionary, brilliant negotiator, soldier, sailor, musician, the best of one nation conservatives. I remember going into the National Gallery one day, and there Ted, as Prime Minister, happened to be, it seemed, sitting in front of a picture which he'd come to look at carefully. I can't think of any other Prime Minister whom one would have found doing that. And yet this was a man who humanly and personally was curiously stunted. Even those of us who cared for him and knew his kindness and experienced his warmth, even we remember the long silences, the apparent rudeness, and the surprising insensitivity. Of course, there was the other side, the one we only saw in private and away from politics. The funny, almost whimsical man who spoke at our wedding and thanked Penny for the 6 years he had worked for her. The kind boss... She didn't want me to say that, but it is too good a story, isn't it? I'm not going to miss it out. He was an immensely kind boss. He wrote New Year epistles to his staff, which showed such understanding and real appreciation, which perhaps they hadn't noticed during the previous year at all. And then there were his many personal letters, whether they were written in his own good handwriting or dictated, which were always full of genuine sympathy and understanding. And these were the flashes of what might have been, or perhaps of what really was. But for the most part, and in most circumstances, for such a remarkable mind and so cultured a soul, he was a personality that simply didn't add up. As a result, his place in history has been hugely understated and his legacy seriously undervalued. His friends and admirers have to admit this fundamental problem, or we cannot effectively begin the reassessment that Ted so richly deserves. In his recent autobiography, Chris Patton illustrates our uphill task. Intellectually, culturally, and politically an ally, Patton is scathing about Heath as a person. And yet he is kind and generous to Margaret Thatcher, with whom he shared practically nothing. If that is true about people who were on his side, it is doubly true of Ted's enemies. And there were and are many. The sheer nastiness that Brexit has unleashed was long a feature of his life. I vividly remember the vicious woman whom the host at a dinner party had seated next to Ted. She changed the place setting so as to be on the other side of the table, exclaiming, "I'm not sitting next to that traitor." That streak of hatred among a certain kind of Tory can be seen most clearly in the obituary edition of the Conservative History Journal. Their assessments of the recently dead former Prime Minister were characterised by real bitchiness and triviality, with all the illiberality characteristic of the hard right. They belittled the few of his achievements they bothered to recognise and concluded he was merely a curmudgeonly irrelevance. Actually, Ted Heath was in many ways the seminal figure in the creation of the modern Conservative Party. Not only did he take Britain into Europe and therefore into the modern world, he saved the party from post-colonial depression and decline. His treatment of the East African Asians, his firm rejection of Enoch Powell's populism, his modernisation of the machinery of government and his reform of the trades unions, all these were essential components in the creation of a Conservative Party capable of governing a Britain devoid of deference and stripped of an empire. What he did made Thatcher possible. The daughter of a grocer could aspire to the leadership of the party only because the son of a builder had made it the kind of party that would accept her. Although she sought always to present herself as far removed from him, a position which he did nothing to discourage, her essential role in freeing the economy from trades union control was only possible because of his earlier reforms, and could only have been carried through successfully because of the rising prosperity our membership of the European community engendered and her own achievement of the single market enhanced. Yet for too long we have allowed him to be seen through her rather than the other way round. For more than a decade, she so dominated British politics that she overshadowed all that had gone before. The great leader is never allowed to have near antecedents, and hers has to be the only legacy. So contemporary Conservative history has been seen only through the Thatcher prism, and written as if she were the true inheritor, and he a temporary aberration. This is a distortion that we need to correct. And we need to correct it not just for truth's sake, but because the myth increasingly impedes the re-emergence of an authentic Conservative Party. Now, none of this is to denigrate Mrs. Thatcher's achievements, nor to set the two up as rivals again. I served both Prime Ministers and would not for one moment deny the essential role Margaret played in the recovery of our nation and its retooling for the modern world. Nevertheless, the attempt of her devotees to turn what was her specific role for a particular time into a continuing philosophy, an alternative to historic conservatism, it's that which lies at the root of our present difficulties as a party. Right from the first, that misinterpretation of her achievement enfeebled the Tory party and led it to make a series of disastrous choices for leadership simply because we were looking to continue her inheritance rather than to fashion a new Conservative response to the world which Tony Blair and New Labour represented. If we'd gone back to our roots, understood what Heath had understood, and had begun again to fashion historic conservatism so that it responded to the aspirations of Mondeo man, we would have provided a powerful opposition to the vacuous self-congratulation of Mr. Blair's superficial synthesis. Instead, we continued to ignore our real political history because we were still caught up in the Peronista illusion. We picked William Hague because he seemed to be a youthful Thatcherite. Ian Duncan Smith because he wasn't Kenneth Clarke. Michael Howard because he seemed safe but still in the Thatcher mould. We turned Europe into a whipping boy, obsessed about immigration, failed to understand the social revolution that was happening around us, and missed out on the way the world now communicated. That nostalgia is what today threatens the Conservative Party's very existence as a political force, and our recovery will demand that we regain a proper perspective by which to view who we are and what we mean to our nation. Just because we are the oldest political party in the world does not guarantee our continued existence. What has ensured that in each new generation is the constant process of so refreshing our enduring principles that they are seen as relevant to the time in which we live. That was what Ted Heath did in his generation. Understanding and appreciating what that was will help us to see how today's Tory party can again find its way back to the Conservative mainstream. Of course, Heath was intellectually well prepared for high office. His reading and grasp of politics was prodigious. When his general library was sold, I bought a number of his well-thumbed books. Some of them he had bought as an undergraduate. Others were testament to his continuous involvement in the history of political ideas. He bothered to understand the argument of others from the left and the right, not just the quotations from commentators. It meant that he grasped the nuances and relished the discussions with thoughtful people of other parties. It explained why he was so good a negotiator with other European politicians, because he knew their history and the intellectual basis from which they derived their attitudes and their arguments. He did not deal in the easy straplines and slogans, the convenient quotations and simplistic wisdom that others mistook for real philosophy. He had read the books, followed the arguments, and discerned the weaknesses. His position was not derivative, but worked through, proofed in serious intellectual fire. That meant that his global view was rigorously based and properly considered, and it would be that many years later would endear him to the Chinese. On the 18th of June, 1970, Heath won an election that the polls had all said he was destined to lose. Together with a number of my friends from Cambridge, I was one of those who provided his majority. He had been a generous neighbour to me, speaking in my support and giving credence to this bearded youth who snatched victory in Lewisham West by 760 votes. We were a merry crew, that 1970 intake. Ken Clarke and Norman Fowler, David Medell and David Knox, Alan Hazelhurst, Sidney Chapman and Robert Hicks, Lawrence Reed and John Wilkinson. We largely came from the same unpretentious backgrounds. We were committed to Britain entering the European community, and we were proud of our new Prime Minister, thrilled that he had proved the polls wrong, and excited that he had given the Conservatives a working majority, not dependent upon the Ulstermen. 18 months later, we were gathered in the House of Commons to hear the result of the vote to approve in principle Britain's entry into the European communities. We knew that we had already participated in the most important vote of our lives. I stood in the well of the House next to Ken Clarke as the result was read out. There were voted ayes 356 and noes 244. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. It's the only time that either of us have shed tears in public. We had done what we had come into politics to do. We had given our country the chance to be a leader again, to move beyond the nostalgia for empire and help forge a Europe where war would be unthinkable and which would be a force for good instead of bringing the world to its knees in pursuit of our internal civil strife. Of course, at the time, we didn't know what was happening in number 10. Ted had returned from his triumphant vote to be joined by his father, brother, and sister-in-law. He sat down at the piano, as he always did when he needed to unwind. He played the first prelude from Bach's 48 Preludes and Fugues. It was symbolic. Britain had rejoined the mainstream. Only after he had finished at the piano could the parting begin. And it was Ted who had done it. Make no mistake, no one else would have had the tenacity or the single-mindedness to deliver this result in the teeth of traditionalist opposition. They were all there, voting with Harold Wilson and his unreformed Labour Party, with a view of Britain which had long gone. Sir Ronald Bell, Sir Richard Boddy, Sir John Farr, Sir Anthony Fell, Sir Hugh Fraser, Sir Donald Cabery, Sir Stephen McCadden, John Sutcliffe, Teddy Taylor, Sir Robin Turton, Sir Neil Martin, Sir Carol Mather, Sir Angus Maud, Sir Jasper Moore, Sir Gerald Nabarro, Enoch Powell, Sir Ronald Russell, Sir Derek Walker Smith. And they never forgave him. They knew now that they had a leader who was determined to build a party not in their image, but one which could capture the minds and hearts of a new generation. In the face of a hidebound Labour Party dominated by reactionary trades unions, the Conservatives had seized the initiative and set the agenda for the future. Mind you, by now we were all blooded. We had fought the Labour night after night on the Industrial Relations Act. It's part of our election manifesto and fiercely opposed by the trades unions and the Labour Party, who rightly saw it as a threat to the stranglehold that organised labour had on Britain's industry and commerce. Again, Heath had shown his tenacity and determination. The woolly heads in the CBI and the liberal commentators had yet again argued for caution and conciliation. They advised that the government should retreat. They talked of compromise and concordat, of bargaining and voluntary restraint. Ted would have none of it. He knew that we had to win this battle if we were to compete in a world which would simply roll over us if we were confined by out-of-date labour practices and restrictive agreements. We voted again and again late into the night. Mrs. Sally Oppenheim resplendent in silk gowns and elaborate slippers, and the rest of us simply longing for it all to be over. Of course, there was much more. The recasting of the government machine, the patient, detailed consideration of the European Communities Act, the battle with militant labour, decimalisation, local government reform, and the Sunningdale Agreement. All these were the work of a man determined on the renewal of his nation and the reformation of his party. He was, of course, in the end defeated. More, I must say, by the quadrupling of the oil price than the NUM. But he had fought the fight, and without him, Britain would be much poorer and less influential, and the Tory party might well have gone the way of all flesh. Much more important, though, is what his example has to teach us today in the ludicrous and embarrassing position in which our country stands. Let us be quite clear, as he would have been. We are where we are because of the serious and stupid decisions of our party, a party that he dragged into the modern world. We misused our mandate and sought to solve our continuing internal divisions not within the parliamentary process, but by the entirely alien system of referendum. We forgot that referenda only work in the Westminster system if you win. Lose, and Parliament can't deal with the consequences. Representative democracy is a great treasure, but it is a jealous master, and we have abused it for our own party political purposes. We didn't even take the most elementary of precautions, but allowed sweeping constitutional reforms without any necessary blocking majority for change, excluded from voting those to whom the result mattered most, and allowed huge sums of money to fund a campaign of lies which its perpetrators now disown and its advocates now admit could never have been delivered. So, in the spirit of penitence that befits the constitutional party that has betrayed the Constitution, we might ask what would have been Heath's advice. Of course, it wouldn't have been very gently put. There would have been a good deal of harumphing, and neither Mr. Cameron nor Mrs. May would have found it comfortable. He could not have resisted saying that he wouldn't have started from here. He would then have said, you don't solve your political problems by resorting to clever wheezes like referendum. You face down your opposition, you argue your position, you challenge them to vote against you, and you win the day. There was never any cop-out with Ted. He wouldn't have let Bill Cash and Liam Fox, Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg seize the agenda. He would have fought Nigel Farage's populism as he fought that of Enoch Powell. He'd have done it because he thought that was the right thing to do, irrespective of those who wanted to appease UKIP. And he would have won. He would have shown that UKIP was a threat to the Labour Party, and that its appeal was to the unreconstructed left, not to the moderate and progressive right. His deep understanding of political history and philosophy would never have allowed him to take the referendum route. He'd have seen it for the aberration it was, and no superficial, press-driven demand for direct democracy would have convinced him. Nor would it have permitted him to go to the country for a mandate to pursue a policy which had neither been defined nor costed. But as so often with Ted, it is better to leave the acid preambles to one side and cut to the chase. What do we do? First, he would remind us that now more than ever, Britain is seen to be part of Europe. Every day that passes, that fact becomes clearer. The most preliminary of Brexit discussions have already revealed the difficulties of severing our limb from the body politic of Europe. And the pre-med for the surgery hasn't even begun. Instead, we are in the early stages of learning that the idea of one man, one vote once has no place in our parliament and belongs to dictatorships alone. The idea that we cannot learn from experience nor change our mind is not one which a parliamentary democracy can entertain for long. Nor would fear of the anger that a thwarted Brexit would engender divert him. He would know there was another anger, the growing anger, as the moderate majority recognised that they lived in a country where an obsessed minority was calling the shots and destroying their future. That anger, he knew, would in the end prevail. What was more, he would see that appeasement would indeed end in the electoral extinction of the Conservative Party. If we become the party that destroys our economy, diminishes our influence and impoverishes our public services, we will become a party that makes way for Mr. Corbyn, just as the magic circle made way for Mr. Wilson. So Heath would insist that those of us who stand in the Conservative mainstream should tell the truth and shame the devil. He would remind us that there have been too many lies and too much deception, and that we must indeed trust the people with the truth. He would perhaps have hit upon, in his terms, a 3-point plan. First, we fight as we did in the Industrial Relations Bill, line by line and clause by clause, to ensure that the renamed, thank goodness, Great Repeal Bill, which was neither great nor a repeal, exactly transfers all our present protections and arrangements into the British law. Not one exception. Not a single extension of the powers of the executive. This must not be an excuse to substitute for the European consensus ministerial diktat. Second, he would expect us to demand the audited accounts of this whole enterprise. Department by department, agency by agency, the British people must know the cost of Brexit, and our representatives in both houses must demand it of every minister who comes to the dispatch box, until finally they recognise their duty in a democracy to comply. How much will it cost? It is indeed a financial scandal that under the cover of not revealing our hand, the government thinks it proper to embark on these negotiations without revealing any figures to Parliament. We are not only buying a pig in a poke, we haven't the faintest idea of the cost of the pig or the value of the poke. When we have those figures, we should insist that they be properly and independently audited, line by line and issue by issue. What will we really owe the EU for our commitments when we leave? What does repatriating our environmental enforcement, product testing, scientific research, health and safety, and all the rest really mean to our national budget? What's the cost of an Irish border? What are the fiscal and public spending consequences, the security and policing implications? In this way, when we come to the crunch, when the deal or no deal begins to emerge, we can ask this Parliament of ours to consider the facts. Shouldn't we think again? Or is this Conservative Party really going down in history as being willing to choose to weaken Britain because it feared to stand up for the truth? Edward Richard George Heath, with all his faults and awkwardnesses, from Munich to Father of the House, never failed to stand up for what he believed to be right. Appeasement was not for him. He loved and fought valiantly for his country, and he would not allow us to betray it now.